Opening the center establishes immediate influence and potential for rapid piece development. Asserting central space, d5 immediately contests the core of the board, setting the stage for a classic symmetrical pawn structure. Challenging the center's stability, this opening creates immediate tension, asking black how they intend to defend their pawn. Embracing the gambit, black frees up their game but relinquishes central pawn presence for active piece development. Developing the knight now pressures the center and prepares castling, a solid developing idea. A pawn lever is being set up, potentially challenging white's central grip or opening a queenside avenue. Establishing a strong central pawn duo and preparing for bishop development, aiming to control crucial squares. Developing this knight naturally prepares castling and eyes white's pawn structure. Securing the central pawn after black's gambit allows white to develop and prepare for future pawn advances. Developing the king's knight harmoniously with the queenside pawn structure solidifies black's central foothold. Securing the king's safety now allows white to focus on developing the remaining pieces and contesting central squares. Challenging white's central grip, black immediately seeks counterplay and aims to liberate their pieces. Developing the bishop to a square where it eyes the kingside and supports a central pawn push is a pragmatic choice. Conceding central influence now invites white's pieces to occupy commanding positions and simplifies black's game prematurely. Reclaiming the pawn opens the e-file, preparing piece activation and central dominance. Developing this piece secures the center and prepares for kingside castling, a sensible step towards active piece play. Developing the knight now prepares to castle and reinforces the central pawn chain. Expanding queenside space aggressively, this pawn thrust aims to cramp white's pieces and potentially build an attack, but it weakens the pawn structure. Unlocking the queenside pawn chain with this aggressive pawn thrust, white seeks to disrupt black's harmonious development and exploit potential weaknesses. Gaining queenside space is a priority, but be mindful of the pawn chain's structural integrity and potential weaknesses. The knight leaps forward, eyeing the black king's developing structure and preparing to exploit the weakened dark squares. Developing the bishop to this diagonal strengthens the queenside and prepares for potential pressure against white's center. Pivoting the queen to support the central advance and eye potential central breakthroughs. Securing the monarch now offers immediate peace of mind, allowing for a more consolidated central presence and potential piece development. Redirecting the rook to the d-file solidifies control and prepares for potential pawn advances or piece pressure. Developing the knight to d7 now bolsters the center and prepares for potential queenside expansion, while keeping the b8 knight free. Solidifying the knight's central influence, white prepares for eventual central pawn advances and defends against a potential black queenside pawn push. Solidifying the queenside pawn chain with a5 sacrifices queenside space for a more robust structure, intending to weather white's central initiative. Developing the bishop to b5 exerts pressure, eyeing a potential knight exchange that could open diagonals or create pawn weaknesses. Liberating the knight to this outpost on b6 seeks to disrupt white's queenside control and potentially eye the c4 pawn. A positional redirection, the knight retreats to reinforce potential central pressure and prepare for future piece development on a more favorable square. Liberating the bishop from its pawn chain, this piece now eyes the central d4 square, posing an immediate challenge to white's queenside development and subtly disrupting white's intended pawn push. Injecting a knight to c5 immediately disrupts black's queenside structure, threatening to pry open lines. Unshackling the knight from its pawn screen, this maneuver aims to reroute it to a more active square and potentially challenge white's queen. Solidifying the central influence and preparing for a potential kingside initiative, this bishop repositioning aims to improve piece coordination. This rook's journey to the 7th rank aims to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially create threats on the open file. Injecting a knight to e5 disrupts black's queen and bishop coordination, potentially opening avenues for a kingside assault. Repositioning the knight to b8 opens lines for rook activity, while also reinforcing the queenside pawn structure, a subtle, long-term positional adjustment. Clearing the path for the knight to access d4, this repositioning prepares for a central pawn advance. Reactivating a knight to the center, this maneuver aims to break free from white's cramped setup and potentially launch counterplay on the queenside or through the d-file. This repositioning of the rook aims to secure the d-file and prepare for potential advances on the queenside, hinting at a protracted positional struggle. Unleashing immediate central pressure, this bishop activation aims to disrupt white's knight outpost and force concessions. Trading the bishop simplifies the position, opening the d-file and creating active piece play for white's queen. Unleashing the queen here overextends her support network, potentially exposing her to immediate pressure and disrupting the pawn structure's stability. Unleashing the rook onto the g-file seizes initiative, aiming for the vulnerable black king with immediate attacking potential. Reclaiming the initiative, this offers a chance to reposition the queen for more active play and potentially counter white's centralized pieces. Unleashing a bold attack, QH5 now targets the vulnerable king and forces black to react defensively. Aggressively challenging white's queenside expansion, this move aims to inject life into black's kingside and potentially disrupt white's attacking plans. Unleashing a dangerous knight maneuver toward the king's escape route, aiming to exploit the weakened dark squares. Unleashing the knight to g4 would be a direct threat, but black chooses to bolster their central pawn structure instead. Aimed squarely at the vulnerable black king, this repositioning intensifies pressure on the kingside. Solidifying the kingside pawn structure, this prepares for potential central pawn breaks and aims to prevent the rh3 rook from infiltrating. Liberating the rook from its cramped position aims to centralize its influence and prepare for potential pressure along the third rank. A strategic retreat, regrouping the rook to a more active file and potentially preparing a counterattack on the queenside. Solidifying the kingside pawn structure, this move aims to prevent further breakthroughs and prepare for potential pawn advances later. Finally, a sensible retreat, reinforcing the queen's defense and preparing to contest the open central file. Reclaiming the central file, the rook now postures offensively, eyeing potential breakthroughs along the open rank. Unveiling the knight to h5 adds significant attacking potential, eyeing g3 and aiming to disrupt white's kingside. Trading queens simplifies into an endgame where white's knight may find better squares than black's. Reclaiming the e7 square normalizes black's pieces and prepares for a potential rook lift. Prioritizing king safety becomes paramount after the pawn exchange, preparing for a more defensive posture. Repositioning the knight to a potentially more active square, freeing the kingside and offering better defensive coverage. Exploiting the now open kingside, white aims to shatter black's pawn structure and expose the monarch. Re-establishing contact on the crucial c-file offers a vital avenue for counterplay, aiming to disrupt white's queenside consolidation. Asserting central control, this rook advance aims to contest the open file and pressure black's beleaguered position. Creating space on the kingside often invites counterplay, but this pawn thrust risks weakening the king's shelter considerably. Fortifying the central defensive structure becomes paramount after the exchange of queens. Unlocking the kingside, this pawn advance aims to disrupt white's central setup and gain space. Pondering a pawn push, white seeks to solidify his central structure against black's advancing queenside attack. Unleashing a pawn, this action opens lines and invites immediate tactical exchanges, potentially altering the pawn structure significantly. Opening the f-file now gives white attacking chances against the exposed black king, but also exposes white's own. A desperate check, aiming to disrupt white's king position after the pawn exchange. The king retreats to safety, seeking refuge from the open files and potential tactical skirmishes. Activating the rook here eyes the weakened white king and prepares for an aggressive pawn push on the kingside. Reclaiming the f-file after the pawn sacrifice initiates a crucial counterplay phase, aiming to exploit white's exposed monarch. The rook's sacrifice offers a tactical opportunity, aiming to disrupt white's center and open lines for the queen. The rooks have been exchanged, simplifying into a king and pawn endgame where white's monarch is more actively placed to assist his pawns. Reactivating the knight to c6 aims to establish a better pawn structure and prepare for potential pawn pushes on the queen side. Clearing the bishop opens diagonals for the rook, eyeing pawn weaknesses. A concession of the bishop pair, weakening the queenside structure for a bit of activity. Opening the f-file creates immediate pressure on black's vulnerable king. Opening that pawn structure invites danger for the king, exposing it to further attack. Opening this file now grants active influence over the critical central squares. Opening the d-file for the rook introduces immediate pressure, though it sacrifices the bishop's active diagonal. Pressing the attack, the rook forces a king escape, potentially opening a diagonal for the queen. A desperate attempt to solidify the pawn chain, but the king remains exposed. The rook now aggressively claims the open file, forcing concessions and threatening to penetrate deep into black's weakened defenses. Activating the rook on f8 offers crucial central influence and prepares to contest the open file, vital for any counterplay. Knight reroutes to the queen side, eyeing central pawns and preparing to contest the now open files. Shifting the king to the side offers some safety and prepares for potential rook activity on the open file. A vital outpost secures the knight, aiming to pry open the pawn structure for an attack on the king side. Aiming to disrupt white's bishop pair and force exchanges, black seeks to utilize the newly opened diagonal for his queen. Challenging the exposed dark-squared bishop on b3, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and gain activity. Attempting to disrupt white's coordinated pieces, black seeks to activate the rook, though the king side remains vulnerable. Reactivating the knight to the central outpost, preparing to exploit the doubled pawns and open files. Offering a surprise pawn sacrifice to disrupt white's rook coordination across the open files. Unleashing the knight to contest the vital d-file, aiming to disrupt black's defensive setup. Relocating the rook to the open file now seizes a critical line and threatens to infiltrate white's position. Reorienting the knight towards the kingside aims to contest the critical g-file, where black's pawn is advancing. Snatching that pawn sacrifices queenside mobility for a material gain, potentially creating an isolated pawn weakness for black later. Capturing the rook opens up the 7th rank, a crucial pathway for white's remaining forces to infiltrate. The bishop retreats, abandoning the open file and leaving the knight exposed to the rook's pressure. Seizing the open file, this rook aggressively probes black's weakened queenside structure, aiming to exploit the isolated pawns.